about the Great Schism of 1054, and this week it's kind of a continuation of part 2 of that, covering kind of the same theme, because what Leo the Ninth does, or begins, I guess, is continued in what Gregory the Seventh will do. So to start, though, just to give you a sense of my source material for all of this, most of tonight's lectures is a lot of the material is coming from this book, The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy by Aristides Papadakis in collaboration with Father John Weindorf. Also, Orthodoxy in the West by Christos Yanaras. Is another text that I've read and have been thinking about, and then 2 texts by Philip Sherrard, who co-labored in the work of putting the Philokalia into English with Metropolitan Callistos Ware. His text, The Greek East and the Latin West, a study in Christian tradition, and then Church, Papacy, and Schism, a theological inquiry. Also, so those are some of the texts that I'm pulling from for the last lecture, this lecture, and and some of the previous ones going forward. Tonight, the topic is the Gregorian reforms and the widening division and the rise of papal supremacy. So the Gregorian reforms are rooted in who we talked about last week, Pope Leo the Ninth. Pope Leo the Ninth is the Pope that is Pope during the Great Schism. And we talked about him extensively then, but we'll kind of continue to come back to him as we go through tonight. The first thing, though, we have to kind of talk about to understand why there was a need for reform is to go back a couple lectures to okay. I don't know if we can. You got a message?
Yes.
At the no sound. So how do we fix that, Deacon Michael? Let's see if we can. Maybe Jason is. Maybe he needs to turn his speakers up. I don't know. Live as it happens, right? This is because I don't know. No improvement. Well, if you want to come mess with this, Deacon Michael, I don't know what.
Oh, there's a little
bit. Well, sorry. Nice to see you. Well, I wish I could see your smiling face, Jason. So I'll try to speak loud. How's that? Because at this point, I'm not sure how to adjust the microphone on this end. The first thing we need to understand to understand this period better is a term that you're all familiar with, I think, from high school and history class, is feudalism. Did you sleep during that?
Yeah, history was one of my sleeping classes.
History was one of your sleeping classes. Okay, so now you get this one. So feudalism, which I didn't realize this, but I learned today as I was working on this, the term emerged not in the 11th, 12th century. This is not what they called this is not how they termed their society. It's a 17th century term that's used to describe the past. So nobody thought we live in a feudalistic society in the 9th, 10th, 11th century. This is a way that a different age looked back upon what came before it and classified it. So, but what does it mean? So this describes the economic, legal, political, and social and economic relationships in Europe. And so what you had is society structured like a pyramid, as in many ways we could do this today. And you have different classes of people. And so at the top is the king. And then there's the lord, in a sense, the great lords, the lesser lords. So we're talking about, and then knights and peasants. And everything, this is, I think there was a president who called this trickle-down economics. I think that was Bush one. I think that was a criticism of Reagan, actually, if I remember right. But way before that was feudalism. And so the land primarily is the king's. It's the king's land. And so if you are one of the dukes, duke being a term that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, because Saint Demetrios, whose feast day is tomorrow, was the Duke of Thessalonica. So you have titles like Duke, Count, Baron, and so forth. Lord, the word Lord itself. You have the great lords, because there's a hierarchy here, and then the lesser lords. So all the great lords are vassals to the king, and the king grants them land, big plots of land. And then the great lords divvy out their land to the lesser lords, and then the lesser lords divvy out their land to the knights. And all the peasants work on everybody's land or attached to the land. And everyone's a vassal, for the most part, of somebody else. Peasants to the knights, or the lesser lords, or the great lords, or even the king. Right? But the peasants are always underneath. But the knight is a knight of some lord, or directly of the king somehow. Right? But this was the structure. And so legally, law, the handing down of land and of jobs and petitions, heredity of title and so forth, that's all tied up in here. Okay? It's also called manorialism. It's another phrase for it, for those who slept through history class. Or manorial is like the manor house. So everything's based on a manor. And so the peasants would be attached to a specific manor. This is a different form of slavery than what we had in the United States, but it's a type of servitude. Feudalism is a type of servitude. Some had it better off than others, but you were tied to a place, and you had legal rights. The knights had to, the lords had to protect you, but you had to work for them. There was this trade, right? They offered you protection, you worked for them, and so forth. And there was the law stipulated, who, as a vassal, what were your rights, and what was the responsibility of your lord to you, and vice versa. And so this was the structure of specifically Carolingian kingdoms that are kingdoms of the Franks, of the Frankish people, the Germanic peoples. Feudalism doesn't exist in the East. This structure isn't inherent in the structure of society in the East, throughout the Middle Ages, or in Eastern Christendom at all. So we keep this in mind. This is a uniquely Western European, Frankish structure that gets exported through Frankish dominance into other parts of Western Europe. Okay, this is not how things worked in the Roman Empire. Okay, so at the time of the Carolingians, feudalism emerges. Appropriation and confiscation of church property occurs in this early Carolingian period to compensate military vassals. And so what you have is so in this structure, the church doesn't sit in this structure so much, but it gets pulled into it in the West. And so what you get is the emergence of what's called the proprietary church. The proprietary church is a church owned by one of these lords. He's the landowner, the landlord. And this structure of you being a vassal of the Lord, and the Lord, in a sense, giving you a plot of land to work in return for service, or providing so many nights, right? This gets applied to the church. The king or lord owns the church land and building, and because he is the owner, he also then takes the right of appointing who the bishop, priest, or abbot, if it's a monastery, who that person is. And the king would then appoint and invest them with the signs of authority. And so in the West, you had the bishop would receive a ring and his staff, his episcopal staff. It would be the Lord, the king or one of the lords, depending on where this was, who would give it to the bishop, not the bishops ordaining him. They would first ordain him, and then he would have to go to the Lord and receive from his Lord, in a sense, his signs of authority, and he would also then have to pledge submission to the Lord, to the king, to the duke, or whoever it was, that he was a vassal. The bishop was a vassal of, or the priest was a vassal of, or the abbot was a vassal of a specific lord, or the king directly. By the 900s, the clergy largely lost their independence and sense of corporate identity. The focus on the Lord, it became you're focused on whoever your sovereign is, your temporal sovereign is, not so much who your bishop is. The diocese does not function really anymore. It exists in name only. The bishop had no real authority over his clergy. Clergy are feudal dependents with responsibility to their lord or the king. And so they had to attend court, they had to give advice, they had to supply military service like all vassals. And now you can see kind of how this practically starts to really alter things on a day-to-day level in society. Knights are supplied by the church. In a sense, the church to, in a sense, pay for their building or their land or the bishop's appointment and so forth. They would have to supply so many knights. And so funds would have to be raised so that a man could be fitted out with armor and trained as a knight and be funded to be a knight. So many, depending on the land or the position, so many knights would be required, and the church would have to provide those. The clergy also become used as government officials. And the then promotion to being a bishop or an abbot starts to be used as a reward for good service, royal service or government service. So there's less of a problem if you're using clergy in many cases as your government officials, because many of those government those positions would be something that a father would want to pass down to his son as inheritance, and that there would be this legal right of your father is position in the royal court, and therefore that would be passed on to the son. But if you're clergy, there's a likelihood that you're celibate, especially if you're a bishop. And therefore, there's no complications of inheritance anymore. The Lord gets to grant that to somebody else when that cleric dies. And also, that was a part of this, right? You had to pay for your position. If you were appointed, there was like an honorarium that you had to give, or a payment to the Lord as a thank you for your position. And so the practice of paying for being the bishop, paying for being the priest, paying for being the abbot became normal. And that's how things worked with being a knight or being a lord. You had to give some kind of money on a regular basis up. Kind of, this is how taxation worked. It was offered up to whoever was above you, ultimately to the king. And that then funded the government and society. And so we call this simony, the buying of office, the buying of priestly office. But it becomes normal. The lay nomination of clergy, of the laity choosing who the bishop or the priest or the abbot was, becomes normal in the 10th century, in the 900s. And it's even upheld by various popes, chastising others for kind of arguing with it, basically saying, no, this is their right as the king or the duke or the whoever it was to nominate who was going to be the bishop or the priest or the abbot. In light of all this, pastoral ministry suffered. The focus of the clergy suffers. This problem of how do you run a government at this point in history was a problem that was also present in the East, in Constantinople. And their solution for this issue of inheritance of position was not to use clerics, but to use the service of eunuchs. That is, men who had been castrated. And so it was seen that eunuchs, in a sense, were trustworthy because they didn't have any loyalty to a family, let's say, or to a son, right? Their motives would be just for the king. The church condemned the practice of making men eunuchs for the sake of government advancement. And so if you had intentionally made yourself a eunuch to advance your career, and then you wanted to become a priest, it was forbidden. But if as a child, your parents had you made a eunuch against your will, or before you had reason, right, then you could enter the clergy. And so that's why in the stories, the lives of the saints in the East, you have all these accounts of women pretending to be men in men's monasteries by claiming that they were a eunuch. Because you had all these men, or a number of them, significant enough that, in a sense, men without facial hair, because they'd been castrated early in their childhood, and so they didn't develop in the same way as other men. They were somewhat more effeminate looking. Was commonplace enough that you could get away with playing the role of the eunuch to hide in a men's monastery, right? There's many saints, women saints, who do this, in a sense, to hide themselves and to repent of their sins. So, can't remember which one, but one that was accused of fathering a child, and she willingly took responsibility for that child, and then at her death, it was revealed that she was a woman. And in a sense, the ability for her father of the child was revealed to be impossible. So, but these kind of things took place. So a bishop would have to buy his diocese, and then the bishop in return could sell the priesthood to other men so as to recoup the money he paid for his diocese. You see how kind of the corruption of this would kind of work, unfortunately. In the era of the Carolingian decline, so the time after Charlemagne and his immediate successors, his sons, the power of the Carolingian Empire fragments, and in a sense, the kings of these three dominant kingdoms are not as strong as their predecessors. And so in this era of decline, which is this period of 900, the kings early on would protect the church from some of these abuses by the lower nobility. But because the kings were weak and they couldn't very well even control their own nobility, which led to much conflict, the lower nobility, in a sense, abused all of these practices with the church in their own area of control. So, though they all recognized the king's divine right to rule was still present, the effective power to do so without challenge wasn't present. He wasn't strong enough. So Rome had insisted on clerical celibacy in the 4th and 5th century. But this was not something that was followed much outside of Rome, the immediate area of Rome's influence. Historically, you had there was the city of Rome with the Bishop of Rome, and then there was the 7 dioceses, the 7 bishops immediately closest to Rome. And this area was the area that the Bishop of Rome, in a sense, was kind of the metropolitan over these other dioceses, basically. And there was this larger archdiocese, if we use kind of our own language, but they would have understood this. That was the historical territory of the Bishop of Rome, not as big as we would think today. In that area, clerical celibacy was very much practiced, of course, with exceptions, but outside of that, not so much. So this is, of course, present then in the 10th century. And you have clergy who are married, clergy who have concubines, and clergy who have mistresses in certain places. And so, but Rome in the 10th century is either indifferent or ineffective to do anything about it. Outside of its own area, even within its own area, it was ineffective, because we reviewed this last week or the week before. The popes of the 10th century kind of was the low point of the papacy in terms of moral uprightness in many ways. But Rome was always seen, even in this period, as the mother church of the West. It was also the place of pilgrimage. And pilgrimage, in many ways, became the main industry of Rome, of the city of Rome. The economic income of people coming from without to Rome, and housing them and feeding them and giving them the grand tour. Right? This is all going on in the 9th, 10th century. But people went to Rome for the relics of the saints and the shrines, not so much to see the Pope. The papal administration, though, of this area and the bureaucracy remained. Kind of the fact that you had the Rome and then these immediate dioceses of bishops, 7 bishops right around, and this kind of became the papal bureaucracy. This all remained intact through the 10th century. The Pope being the figurehead, not so much the power, but the figurehead. And so we see kind of the situation that leads up to this reform. From 900 to 1050, there are 35 different popes. And to compare this with the Bishop of Constantinople, there were 15 in the same time period. Rome had 20 more popes in this time period. So the turnover was much more immense. I think every 4 years there was a new pope.
Because of the death rate or just being voted out?
Both. Death, voting out, scandal. Again, remember, the aristocracy of Rome very much controlled the papacy at this time period, the local nobility, and they were in it for themselves in many ways. And so the popes turned over, right? So you also have the fact that when you get into the mid-900s, the imperial power of what we call the Holy Roman Empire emerges under Otto I. Otto I has Pope John XII crown him emperor in 967. And then Otto proclaims, the emperor proclaims, all future popes will swear allegiance to imperial envoys or to the emperor directly before taking office. Imperial authorization of popes' elections will be also required. So the emperor, this is the territory of what we think of modern Germany, but also northern Italy, and parts of France and Switzerland, and the Low Country. This is the area that the Holy Roman Emperor would have been the emperor of. It contained numerous kingdoms within it, whereas the Kingdom of France was just one kingdom, a significant one to the west. But they were both descendants of Charlemagne. They both came from that Carolingian descent. And so, but he was the strongest individual at the time in terms of this area of Western Europe. So imperial power basically was over the Pope. The Pope is the de facto imperial official, or the chaplain to the emperor, basically. And from 962 to 1062, 21 of 25 popes were handpicked by the emperor of this Holy Roman Empire, this Germanic, not Constantinople. And so that's the context into which the Reform movement is born. Okay, a degraded clergy, very much controlled by nobility, by the emperor, and parish clergy were kind of at their low point. Not very impressive. What was impressive, though, in this period was monastic reform that began at the monastery of Cluny, Cluny. This is in Burgundy, like the wine. Burgundy, if you know your geography, is kind of, if you think of the center of France and you start to go northeast, you'll run into Burgundy. Okay, in that area, towards what is modern day Germany, this is where Burgundy is. Dijon, the city of Dijon, like the mustard, is within Burgundy historically, I believe. Cluny, as a monastery, is founded in 910, and there's this unique status of Cluny being directly under the Pope. The founders of the monastery were very savvy. They were within this feudalistic society, and they saw the problems of it, and so they were able to place the monastery directly under the Pope, outside of the jurisdiction, not just of the local bishop, but also the jurisdiction of the local lord. The lord who donated the property, they in a sense, they were convinced him, in a sense, to be hands off, that they were directly under the authority of the Pope. And because of this, they could elect their own abbot. No one outside of the monastery elected their abbot, whereas everywhere else, some local lord chose who the abbot was going to be. And it didn't matter if that person was faithful or celibate or whatever. You know, as long as Joe had been a good supporter of me as the Duke, then Joe got to become the abbot, along with his mistress and 3 kids. Right? It didn't matter. So that's a hypothetical. So, but Cluny was an exception to this at this time period. It itself, in 150 years, roughly 130 years, becomes the mother monastery of 2,000 monasteries. It becomes a monastic empire. And because of its structure of governance, all the other monasteries are directly under the abbot of Cluny. This becomes kind of this exception to this feudalistic society in some sense. Cluny sits outside of this. Wherever a monastery of Cluny is, it sits outside of this structure. And so therefore, in a sense, it can run itself, and it becomes, in a sense, the standard for reform. It doesn't produce the reform movement, it kind of gives this picture of what would be possible. If you could pull yourself out of the structure, what could you do with it? Cluny becomes this inspiration. Cluny, as a monastic movement, is following the Benedict form of monasticism, which was the normative form in the West up until this point. And its emphasis was internal, on the monks themselves. It wasn't looking outward at society, wanting to revitalize or change or revolutionize society itself. It was focused on men repenting of their sins, which is the norm of monasticism. So, but the Reform movement, inspired by what Cluny had done, is not looking just within. It does that, but very much within the church, the problems within the church, but then it turns outwards and problems with this. And how do we fix this? So, who are the Reformers? They aren't Romans. They don't come from Rome. They come from Burgundy, where Cluny is, and a little further northeast, the region of Lorraine, where other kind of monastic settlements had begun in imitation of Cluny. And the Reformers, the popes, who are the popes of this reform, all come from those areas. They are Franks, or Frenchmen, in a sense, even though at this point, French and German is the same thing, basically. They're Carolingians. So this is very much a Germanic or Frankish movement. And Leo the Ninth, originally was Bishop of Toul, Toul, in Lorraine. That's where he came before he became Pope of Rome. And Leo the Ninth is not the first of the reformers. It's interesting. It's Henry III, or who we call Henry the Pious. So Henry III, not of England, but of the Holy Roman Empire. And he's called Henry the Pious or Henry the Black. The Black because of his attachment to, I think, the clergy, who were black. Right? The monks, the Benedictine monks, had black robes. So, not brown ones. Not like Friar Tuck and, Robin Hood. He wasn't a Benedictine. So, he is emperor from, 1046, I believe, to 1056. He himself installs 4 different popes in his reign. Leo the Ninth being the third of them in 1449. So there were 2 others from 1446 to 1449. There were 2 other popes before Leo in quick succession. Leo is a cousin to Henry III. He is the cousin of the emperor. So in 1046, Emperor Leo, he ended what was called the Papal Schism. There were 3 candidates for 3 men claiming to be Pope in 1046. This is what Henry does. He deposes all 3 of them and appoints Pope Clement II as Pope and has Clement crown him as emperor. But in doing so, he frees the Vatican or the papacy from dependency on the Roman nobility. He's the one that extracts the popes from being dependent on the aristocracy of Rome. And so in this, he makes the opportunity for them to kind of chart their own course. And he lays the foundation for its emperor-wide authority. But he dominated the papacy in his lifetime, but he was the last of the emperors to do so. For Leo the Ninth is very much the beginning of this reform, and his aim was to reform the church, specifically the clergy. So his focus was inward, And he began by focusing on simony and unchastity of clergy. So we'll erase some of this. We can start listing the things that the reform was after. So again, Leo the Ninth. So simony and unchastity of clergy. And what he does, outside of his involvement in the Great Schism and of the events of 1054, he spends 4.5 years of his 5 years as Pope on the move, basically, which is unusual, unheard of for a Pope. He traveled outside of his archdiocese specifically to try clergy for simony and unchastity. He would go into other people's dioceses and try the bishops if he thought that they had been elected with simony, if they had bought their office. And he would depose them and replace them. And he would try to insist upon clerical celibacy. And he would have local synods in what is modern day France and Germany and so forth, Italy, to push forward, in a sense, these reforms. He reorganized and enlarged the office of the cardinal. So we all know of Catholic cardinals, not the birds. But a cardinal in Rome, the first persons to be called cardinals were actually deacons of the 7 regions of the city at the beginning of the 6th century. And when the word began to mean principal, eminent, or superior, like a cardinal was like an archdeacon, in a sense, as that's how we would think of them. The name was also given to the senior priest in each of the title churches, meaning the parish churches in Rome. So if you were the parish priest, if I was the parish priest of one of the churches in Rome, I would have the title of being the cardinal, in a sense, a superior priest, because I'm the head of a church of Rome. And also the title became used for the bishops of the 7 dioceses surrounding the city. Those were the cardinal bishops. By the 8th century, the Roman cardinals constituted a kind of privileged class among the Roman clergy, and they took part in administration of the church, and specifically, initially, it was in they were involved in the papal liturgy. They had a liturgical function. But it's Leo that expands their function to make the cardinals, whether they were deacons, priests, or bishops, his co-workers, his legates, meaning his representatives, his principal counselors, and his advisors. And so the cardinals become, in a sense, this bureaucratic body, this advisory body, expanding kind of the size of what we think of as what comes to be called the curia, or the kind of the government of the Pope. So it's then in 1059, after Leo, in 1059, Nicholas II is Pope, and he makes the cardinal bishops, he gives the cardinal bishops the authority of what's called metropolitan authority. So we have metropolitans. They're the bishops of kind of the most important cities, and they usually are over an archdiocese with diocesan bishops under them. And so the metropolitan, in a sense, has a preeminence in an area. And so the cardinals are granted this kind of preeminence or hierarchy of seniority. And kind of the leading role. The cardinal bishops become the leading bishops within the church. But they also are given the role of electing the new pope. And so the election of the pope in 1059 is given to the cardinals largely. And so therefore, it's not the emperor anymore who's going to decide. It's the College of Cardinals, which that's how it is to this day. They're the electors of the new bishop of Rome. So Leo, though, you had all these hopes of reform. Leo gives practical program and structure to the hopes of the reform. He starts to put them in place. And it's those who come after him are just building upon what he starts. And that then takes us beyond Nicholas to Gregory. Gregory the Seventh. He is Bishop of Rome from 1073 to 1085. He, as a young man named Hildebrand, was a monk. I don't remember if he's from Cluny, but the Burgundy-Lorraine area. And he is amongst those in service to Leo IX. I believe as a deacon, and was in a sense a disciple of Cardinal Humbert, who we talked about last week, the one who goes to Constantinople and issues the excommunication of the patriarch. He does not go with him, I believe, but he's a close kind of he's definitely a disciple of Humbert, and in the same vein as Humbert. So he launches what people call the Gregorian reforms once he takes the papal office. This is not the emergence of the Gregorian calendar, though. That's a different Gregory. Reforms of the Gregorian calendar comes under Pope Gregory the 13th in 1582. So we're not there yet. This is a different Gregory. So the Gregorian reforms take up four main issues. Simony is one of them. Unchastity of clergy also is another one. But also what is called investiture. And this is the feudal structure of laymen choosing bishops and investing them with authority. And then, fourth, papal supremacy. The idea of papal supremacy is found in Leo. Gregory just gives further emphasis and note to it and articulation. And what we see, kind of a story from the life of Gregory that it kind of expresses this idea of papal supremacy and investiture that he really takes on, is involved with the emperor of his own day, the son of Henry III, which is Henry IV. They did not get creative with names. Henry IV becomes king of Germany as a child. I don't know exactly how old, maybe 4 or 5, I believe, because I think he's born 1050. He's king of Germany in 1054, king of Italy in 1056, but he's crowned emperor in 1084. So in 1065, he's old enough to rule in his own right. And so a lot of the time when he's a child, his authority is eroded away by the other nobility because he's just a child. And either his mother, he actually gets kidnapped by a bishop, I think, and who kind of serves as his regent for a while. And then he's able to, once he's 15 or 16, he becomes king on his own right. And he starts to try to pull back his authority from his nobility. Well, this doesn't make him very popular at the start. And so And he doesn't necessarily get along with Gregory. So Henry persuaded most of the German bishops to declare Pope Gregory's election invalid on the 24th of January in 1076. He'd been Pope for 3 years already. In response, the Pope excommunicates Henry, releasing his subjects from their allegiance. So remember, the king is up on the top and everyone has allegiance up to him. But the Pope basically says, you're excommunicated and I remove your kingship from you. And that means all of the people under you are not in your authority anymore. And they can do what they want. Kevin.
Wouldn't that just cause chaos and a civil war?
That's what it would have cost. But Henry understood this. And so he meets the Pope in northern Italy. This is a kind of one of these legendary stories of Henry walking in penance to Pope Gregory to repent of what he had done. And Gregory is, he's played the power play here, right? But because Henry shows himself to be a penitent and a loyal son of the church, right? Gregory has to reinstate him and therefore nullify any chance of the nobility running amok, because that's what Henry understood. So Henry was in a pickle. And so he took the kind of short-term humiliation so as to gain, for long-term gain. And Gregory dies in exile while Henry is king. So kind of flips. But a precedent here, again, is being set by Gregory that the Pope can excommunicate the king, not just excommunicate him, but take his kingdom away from him. He gets to judge who's the king, again, or who the emperor is.
So who exiled Pope Gregory?
He had to go into exile because Henry was after him, I believe. So, but there's this precedent that becomes set, and a claim of papal supremacy. It's not every. This is the thing. There's a claim made, but you cannot always exercise that claim, right? And so claims of the Pope having authority had been made for a long time, but they couldn't always be exercised because people didn't listen to him, right? If you claim authority, but people don't recognize that authority, you can't do anything about it unless you have a mechanism or a power to enforce it on people, right? So for the most of the history, on and off, popes would make claims of authority for different things, but never in the same grandeur or extent as Gregory and Leo. And that's the thing that changes. And so Henry, as a penitential, has this famous walk to Canossa and meets the Pope and succeeds in having Gregory absolve him in January of 1077. So, but Gregory's ideas about all of these things, right? This is what he's focused on, his papal reforms. Simony, getting rid of simony, enforcing clerical celibacy, getting rid of investiture, lay involvement in who the bishops are, and their control, the temporal authority having control over the church in any way, and the Pope being the authority. And so to this end, we have this famous document of his called the Dictatus Papae, or the Dictates of the Pope. And I'm going to read them to you. In a sense, there are 27 of them, but these are his claims about the authority of the Bishop of Rome. The first, the Roman Church is founded by the Lord alone. Alone, period, stop. The Lord founded Rome, period, stop. That's it. And from Rome, the rest of the church comes. That the Roman pontiff alone is called universal by right. He is the universal Pope. That he alone can depose and reconcile bishops, which then places him above all other bishops. That his legate, meaning his representative, presides in council to all bishops, even when he is of inferior grade, and can give a sentence of deposition against them. So if the Pope sends a deacon as a legate, the deacon sits in judgment of a bishop because he's the legate of the Pope. That the Pope can depose those absent. That among other things, we neither ought to remain in the same house of the one excommunicated by him. If the Pope excommunicates the king, don't remain in his household, meaning a part of his service. You can't. If the Pope excommunicates the king, you have to abandon your support of the king or your obedience to that king. That for him alone it is licit, or meaning right, according to the necessity of time, to establish new laws, to welcome new peoples, to make new abbacies of canonical right, and contrariwise, to divide rich bishoprics and unite needy ones. Basically, if the Pope needs to make new laws, he can do it unilaterally, and he can structure the church how he sees fit by dividing or combining existing dioceses or creating new monasteries and so forth. That this is his authority alone. That he alone can use the imperial insignia, which was given, the claim was by Constantine the Great, that this authority was given to the Pope. And we talked about that false document, the donation of Constantine. This is Gregory's relying on the same kind of substance. That all princes are to kiss the feet of the Pope alone, which for us modern people seems rather silly, kind of outlandish. But you would show homage to your Lord, who you are a vassal of. You would show forms of homage, what we would think of as veneration, right? Not, we do this still. If the president walked in the room, we'd all stand up, showing our respect. Whereas there were various forms of homage that you would show, either bowing, getting on your knees. You saw this in the coronation for King Charles, where his son, who is his vassal, came and knelt before him and placed his hands together within his hands and pledged obedience to him. That gesture is where praying this way comes from in the West. That position of prayer comes directly out of this kind of the vassal giving homage to his Lord. That's where that posture comes from. You don't find it before this as a kind of position for prayer. But that's what you saw the son of the king do. And the king put his hands around his hands and received his pledge, his obedience.
But the East doesn't really like this.
No, we never have. Yeah, this is a Western thing. But that's where it comes from. The name of him, of the Pope alone, is to be recited in the churches. So in our liturgy, what do? We say, the priest says in the midst of liturgy, among the first, be mindful, O Lord, of our metropolitan or our bishop, right? Whoever that is. And it's then the metropolitans who commemorate the patriarch, but within the diocese of the patriarch, they only commemorate the patriarch because it's his diocese. So you commemorate the local authority. But here, only the Bishop of Rome is to be named, not the local bishop. So again, the Bishop of Rome is assuming direct authority over all churches. And therefore, his name is the only one to be mentioned. Everyone is a vassal of the Pope, basically. That this is the only name in the world, that's 11, that for him it is licit to depose emperors. It is proper for the Pope to depose emperors. That for him it is licit, when driven by necessity, to transfer bishops from one see to another. That the Pope can decide, oh, you're here, we're going to move you over here. That he validly ordains any cleric from any church wheresoever. In our tradition, a bishop can't come into another person's diocese and ordain someone without the express permission of the bishop of the diocese or archdiocese. He can't come in, and no bishop can come into another bishop's diocese and do anything without the express blessing of the residing hierarch. And this is how it functions for the priests, right? I had a wedding to do. I was in Stillwater for one of our parishioners, was marrying one of their parishioners, right? But the wedding was in Stillwater. The priest in Stillwater had to personally invite me to concelebrate with him. I couldn't go and say, well, I have a wedding, I'm going to come down and blah, blah, blah. No. It's not how it works. It was, Father Mark, my parishioner is marrying your parishioner. You know, this is your show. You know, and he would say, Father Nikolai, you are welcome to come and concelebrate with me with his blessing, because it's his parish that he's in charge of. So it works with the clergy just like it works with the hierarchs.
Did you have to get, if we had a bishop, would you get bishop based on had been here?
Mm-hmm.
You had to get his blessing also?
If it was on a Sunday and I was going to miss, yeah.
So, Father, isn't that how that is with monasteries also? That a bishop going to a monastery is the monastery head is still the head? And makes the decisions or not?
The abbot of a monastery, the question is, does this how it works in a monastery? In many ways, yes and no, because the monastery is under the authority of a diocesan bishop. So the abbot runs the monastery, and the bishop usually gives him he doesn't try to interfere, because the abbot is the spiritual father of the monastery and he's elected by the monastery. So, but the bishop is the one who will ordain the clergy. So there is a kind of a reciprocal relationship between the diocesan hierarch and the monastery. So they're within the jurisdiction of the diocese. They don't sit outside of it historically. So there can be some tension there sometimes if the abbot, and this is the case, sometimes the monks are the ones who are the most outspoken if they think the bishop isn't doing his job right. So there's a kind of a check and balance there, right? But the laity do have that authority of checking, right? Of complaining about the priest or the bishop, right? Kind of up the chain. So, but not with the Bishop of Rome. That the one ordained, this is now 15, the one ordained by him can take charge of any church, but not serve as a soldier, and that he ought not to accept superior grade from any bishop. If you've been ordained by the Pope, you can't be touched by another bishop, basically. They can't elevate you without the permission of the Pope. That no synod without his precept ought to be called general. So that, again, it's not just that the Bishop of Rome is above other bishops, he's also now above the synod. He's above the council. That no chapter be held and no canonical book be recognized without his authority. So anything that's being written, right, he has to be the final say on it. That his sentence ought to be retracted by no one, and that he alone can retract that of all. So if he makes a judgment, nobody can question it and retract it, but he can retract anyone's decision. Any other bishop's decision, he can nullify it. That he himself must be judged by no one. Remember, this was an idea even in the day of Charlemagne, that Alcuin, Charlemagne's advisor, said, oh, you can't judge the Bishop of Rome. That no one dare condemn the one appealing to the apostolic see. That the greater cases of every church whatsoever must be referred to Rome. If there's problems, you got to take them to Rome. That the Roman Church has never erred, meaning Rome has never made a mistake, nor will ever err in perpetuity, as Scripture testifies. So basically, the Bishop of Rome can't make a mistake. If he is properly elected, he can't make a mistake. And he's never made a mistake, which historically is inaccurate, because there are bishops of Rome who are heretics, declared by councils, right? So that the Roman pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is indubitably made holy by the merits of St. Peter, according to the testimony of St. Ennodius, Bishop of Pavia, with many holy fathers favoring him, just as is contained in the decrees of blessed Pope Symmachus. Basically, if you become Pope, you're a saint by the merits of Peter. If you properly become the Pope, you are a saint. That by his precept and license it is licit for his subjects to accuse, that he can depose and reconcile bishops without a synod, that no one is to be held to be Catholic who does not concord with the Roman Church. To be a part of the church means you're in communion with Rome. That he can absolve the subjects of the iniquitous from fidelity. So, meaning, if you've made an oath to a lord, a duke, a king, the Pope can absolve you of that responsibility that goes with that oath. Again, that the Pope is supreme. Well, we think of this as the papal monarchy over the church. That all bishops are subject to him, that all kings are subject to him. And that also only the Pope is the successor of Peter. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, this idea of Peter being, in a sense, that Peter is the chief of the apostles, right? That he, this idea of sitting in the seat of Peter is the highest authority in the church, right? In the Orthodox Church, the understanding is that every bishop sits in the seat of Peter. Doesn't matter what you're a bishop of, a big city, a little city, whatever, all bishops equally have the authority of Peter, of being, in a sense, of apostolic succession, of apostolic authority, and so forth. That no one bishop, in a sense, has a greater episcopal authority than another. They may have a different administrative authority, but no one's less a bishop because he's a bishop of a small city than another. Does that make sense? So you have this sense that the papacy is above the episcopacy. The papacy is something different than the episcopacy, and that the papacy is superior even to the synods and the councils, and that the papacy has a universal jurisdiction. And for Gregory, this is a restoration. What he's doing is restoring papal authority, not creating something novel in his mind. But to everyone else, it was, at least in the East, it was very novel. And what this is a change. The Pope historically had a primacy. Right? A primacy, very much of primacy of honor, because he was the Bishop of Rome. And in many of the councils, this is stated, because he's the bishop of the imperial capital, of the historic imperial capital. That was usually one of the first reasons why. Because of the importance of the city, that's why the Bishop of Rome had this primacy of honor, because Rome was the most famous city in the world. And it was where Peter and Paul died. And where all kinds of other martyrs died. Remember, Rome was a place of pilgrimage. And this why Rome had primacy. But it was the primacy of honor. It didn't put the Pope above any other bishop. In a sense, the Pope had the place to stand first. When bishops gathered, the place of honor, the first place, right, went to the Bishop of Rome. And then to the Bishop of Constantinople, and then to the Bishop of Alexandria, and then to Antioch, and then to Jerusalem. This was the order of hierarchy of honor of what was called the Pentarchy, what became the 5 most important episcopal sees in the ancient world. And so he had primacy of honor within the Pentarchy as one of the Pentarchy, of one of the 5 bishops. But all bishops were equally bishops, but he held a primacy of honor. What goes on here is primacy is replaced with supremacy. And this is a radical change, and a change of ecclesiology, of the structure of the church or what the church is. That there is now no independent hierarchy. Everyone is, in a sense, answerable to Rome. The Pope is not a part of the Pentarchy, he's over it. He stands above it. Papal supremacy is seen alone as being the thing alone that could guarantee church unity and renewal by the reformers, by Leo and Gregory and the others, in their context. Because in their context, they lived in a feudal system. And this was their answer to the problems of their feudal system. They took the title Vicar of Christ, which historically was given to the emperors, right? Because they were the kings. They were Christ's vicar on earth to govern the affairs of the temporal world, not the spiritual affairs, but the temporal. And in the East, you had this idea that the emperor and the clergy, right, they were to operate in symphony with one another. One did not claim the other's authority. The authority of each came directly from God. And so the emperor was Christ's vicar on earth to establish justice and order and to protect the innocent and the weak and so forth, and to structure the rules of society, right, in imitation of the heavenly reality. The bishops, right, they governed the church, of which the empire was within. But they oversaw the spiritual needs, the sacramental needs, right? They defined the faith for the emperor, and the emperor tried to implement it. You see the difference? But each got their authority from God. But in the West, right, there's this kind of the kings take over the church, and then the church has to kick the kings out, basically. And there's this battle going on, which in a sense continues to this day. We're the heirs of all of this. And this confusion as to, in a sense, what right is the king or the government and the church, and how do they interact with each other, right? We live in a country that still is confused about all of this, right? And the rest of the classes will be, in a sense, pointing this out. But this sense of the Pope, this was the way of bringing order to the feudal society. Putting the Pope above everything else, then he could order everything right, even the kings. That he had spiritual superior, he was spiritually superior and temporally superior to all. And that's why he becomes a monarch, in a sense. Popes had been deposed by emperors in the past, but now the Pope could depose emperors. And that's what happened with Henry IV. He got deposed. And so this conflict between emperors and popes, right, is just going to carry through the Middle Ages, this working out, as we said before. Other issues, though, that get caught up in this reform, the filioque. Interesting. It's introduced in Rome at the coronation of Henry II in 1014. This is the Frankish practice in theology, and this is imposed on Rome. But the reformers take it for granted as the normative practice, because where do they come from? They come from the Frankish or the Carolingian kingdoms. This is what their inheritance was. And so the fact that it's practiced in Rome, even though it's foreign to the practice of Rome, is normative for them. Because really what's going on, the reformers are very much bringing to Rome, in a sense, their Carolingian mind in imposing a new structure, an adaptation of what's already present on Rome, and then on the rest of the West. And so they never question the presence of the filioque. It's just a given, even though it's novel in Rome since 1014. Clerical celibacy. Married priests are conceived of as a heresy by the reformers, called Nicolaitanism. Nicolaitanism, it comes from the book of Revelation. It's something that I think Laodicea is warned about accepting. It doesn't historically have anything to do with married clergy, but this is what Rome associates it with. And it's seen as a heresy as opposed to just a question of spiritual discipline. And the fact that it's seen as a heresy is very problematic for the West, because their understanding of the significance of marriage, right? If it's wrong for priests to marry, then why is it right for lay people to marry? Right? This begins or helps split society between clerics and laity, and create this divide between the church and the world, right? Because the church becomes synonymous with the clerics. That's what the church is. It's the clergy, not the laity. The laity are of the world. And so this distinction between the two is created and exacerbated through this time by this emphasis on clerical celibacy. But clerical celibacy is seen as a solution to removing lay control of the clergy, of the laity being able to, in a sense, invest or nominate the clergy. By making, in a sense, monasticizing the priesthood, this is a corrective to the clerical involvement in the world, trying to pull the clergy out of their involvement with the government and with the things of the world. By making them all celibate, this is the answer put forth. It creates also this sense of a spiritual elite. If all the clergy are celibate, and resulting in a sharp opposition, again, between laity and clergy and what we call clericalism. The church becomes associated with the clergy, not the laity. And the division in society between sacred and profane is demarcated and widened. An imbalance that continues to play itself out. Whereas in the East, there's less distinction between laity and clergy. A parish priests, they're mostly married. Your kids play with their kids. Your kids marry their kids. There's much more of this organic interconnection between the priest and his people in a given place. And families, it's normal to say, for families to talk about, oh yeah, my sister married a priest, or my sister's husband's a priest, or my nephew became a priest, or this connection to the clergy is much tighter in the East because married men are allowed to be ordained deacons and priests and subdeacons. But in the West, celibacy was placed upon the clergy. The reform itself is coercive and top-down. This is not bubbling up from underneath. It's coming top-down. There's no awareness of the context of the church outside of the reformers' own context. Their awareness of their own kind of Carolingian context is all they have. And so their solutions to their problems are the universal solutions to the whole church. And that's why papal supremacy becomes this issue that divides. Because they try to impose from without their solutions on the East. And this manifests itself not just in the East, but also in the West. When William the Conqueror, in the midst of the start of the reforms, right, he's coming from Normandy, right? He's a Carolingian vassal, basically. But he conquers, he's the Duke of Normandy, he conquers England. And when he conquers England in 1066, what does he do? He throws out all the Anglo-Saxon clergy and replaces them with clergy from the Kingdom of France. And brings in, French becomes the language, or Latin becomes the language of the clergy and of the nobility, right? It's this replacement and imposing from without this new model on top of what's already present, purging it of what is there and replacing it with what you feel is best, right? That's what goes on. And many of the nobility and the higher clergy, where do they go? They go to the East. So much so that there are cities in what is modern day Ukraine and Crimea, historically, called New York. Because they relocate as refugees where? To the Black Sea region from England. And they go where? They go to under the protection of the Emperor of Constantinople. Because they don't want to have the Frankish ways imposed on them. Their Anglo-Saxon ways are being purged. So the same kind of spirit then comes with the Crusaders when they conquer in the Holy Land. They replace what's present with what they have from France or from the Holy Roman Empire and so forth. Because there's one universal solution to everything. It's this model. And you have to plant it wherever you go. And that's characteristic of Western Christianity basically going forward, unfortunately, in many places, all the way up into the 20th century, or the 18th, 19th century especially. But that's what we will start to talk about next week when we cover the Crusades. Questions? No? All right. God bless you all. Next week, we talk about the Crusades as long as the birth of a baby doesn't prevent it. Bye-bye.